Hi there, I'm Matthew. I'm a South African. And hey, times are tough down here at the moment. And with all the talk in Zimbabwe and talk of downgrades and state capture and all the rest of it, it really is enough to make you hugely depressed. Now one day, if you are depressed, please do yourself a favor. Get to the Franschhoek in the Western Cape and go and visit the KUSASA project at 7:30 in the morning. I did that the other day. It was incredible. I've never seen kids so keen on their school, disciplined, there on time, smiling, this wonderful energy that we had about the place. So I came back home and decided to do a lecture about education and life in South Africa, and very importantly, the life that is to come in South Africa. Because of all the things that are going wrong at the moment, people are dwelling on the present and not looking at the enormous potential that there still is in Southern Africa. So let's start off with the depressing stuff. We all heard about the departure of Prof as Minister of Finance back in March. More recently, we have had the resignation of another terrific person, Michael Sachs, who was at National Treasury. And for years, he has looked after South Africa's numbers. An absolute labor of love. And I've cribbed one of his slides off him. This is a study by National Treasury. And it says that if South Africa doesn't create 9 million good new jobs in the next 50 years, we risk having social chaos. And we need to go into that in the story about South Africa and what's good and what's bad about the place and see what it's all about. So let's start off. 3 years ago, at our mini budget in October, we got some announcements and they said, hey, we have to make some tough decisions about this country. These decisions can no longer be postponed. This is not the current Minister of Finance, Muzi Gigaba, talking. This was, in fact, Nene, the Minister of Finance that came for a short while after Prof Gordhan. He said that to Parliament 3 years ago, and he was talking about South Africa's debt trajectory. So we take that and we say, well, what's gone wrong? And basically it's this. We got to the financial crisis in 2009 along with the rest of the world. And we listened to the world economists, and they said, hey, it would be a V, quick down, quick up. And then we will be carrying on trucking yet again. Well, it hasn't happened with our growth rates. The world has had a sluggish recovery. South Africa's recovery has been even more sluggish. And that leaves us with a very difficult position. So, when it came to our taxes, we managed to survive the first 5 years after the financial crisis. But more recently, we are having problems in getting enough taxes together to keep South Africa going. It goes like this. Back in February of 2017, Prof Gordhan, still Minister of Finance then, said there's something wrong with the tax system. All the taxes are under collecting to the extent of 27 billion rand a year. That was a very worrying position. They then set a budget for the year coming up where they said, well, the personal taxpayer can pay for it in South Africa with a little bit of help from companies, a bit of dividend tax, and of course, we'll hit fuel and smokers as well and give away practically nothing. That was back in February. Of course, the result was that in March, Gordhan was replaced with Muzi Gigaba. Muzi Gigaba now picks up the ball, and we have to say, well, has he got the same problems as Gordhan? Gordhan was heavily reliant on personal taxes in South Africa, and he was trying to protect the poorer South African while hitting hard at the higher end. But it wasn't enough, and it's still not enough. What you find in South Africa when you see the great sights of South Africa is there's tremendous opulence. It's sort of in your face. But we only have 13 million taxpayers registered out of a population of 56 million people. Hey, and nearly 7 million of them are not even earning enough to pay tax. Then we have a middle class that pays about 32% of South Africa's personal tax. And up the top 1% decile, as we call it, About 1 million people earning about over 500,000 Rand per annum, and they are paying 62% of South Africa's tax. And when we talk about wealth in South Africa, there is staggering inequality. What we see is that you are in the top 10% of South Africa if you earn more than 150,000 per annum. That's a teacher's salary. They're in the top 10%. And the top 1% of South Africans earn more than 600,000 per annum. By the time you get to earning 1.5 million Rand per annum, well, you know, there are only about 103,000 South Africans who do that. So South Africa has this tiny, minuscule number of wealthy people up the top with a carefree lifestyle. But it goes further. When one looks at wealth distribution in South Africa, the surveys are showing that South Africa, measured in terms of a wealth Gini coefficient, has a Gini coefficient of 0.95. That is very close to perfect inequality at level 1. And then, of course, there is the legacy of apartheid, which shows in wealth distribution, relative to the white community in blue up the top, we see that the other communities are way behind. So South Africa has a massive inequality problem. Now we add into that our economic numbers that are in a very, very difficult position. We're looking at growth of 1.3% per annum at the at best outlook. But what we're doing at the moment is a mere 0.7% growth. Now, Thomas Piketty, the rockstar economist, he might say to you, hey, 1% real growth is okay, providing it's above your population growth rate. So we take that and we say the situation has deteriorated substantially in the last 6 months. Our National Development Plan, which was released in 2012, everything was planned on a 5.4% growth rate. And in the period 2010 to 2016, we got a mere 1.8%, and we're not even achieving that yet. So what happens? We can't cut back on expenditure because there's so many poor people, and the tax base is fully taken up. So we have to borrow. So what we see is that in the last 6 months, the debt trajectory that we established back in February and put that as the target has worsened to a far worse position in just the last 6 months. Quite terrifying. This was predicted by the World Bank, who visited the Parliament back in February. And they said, hey, what's going on here? Your National Development Plan said that you would create 600,000 new jobs per year, every year until 2030. You are struggling to create 250,000 jobs. And this is leaving a massive unemployment problem in an unskilled youth in South Africa. And their question was, what are you going to do about it? Well, the answer is not much. So basically put, where we are with the population at the moment is, prior to the financial crisis, South Africa's growth rates were above their population growth. Way above it. We were making progress. Then the whole world fell in a hole, and everybody said we'd come back. South Africa did come back, but the position has been worsening steadily since 2009. And now we have reached that critical point where our economic growth rate is below our population growth rate. We're going backwards. Of course, in a position like this, the state has to borrow. A lot of people, including the UK, are having to borrow at the moment. But our debt trajectory has got unsustainable. And of course, the rating agencies are then piling in and saying, what are you going to do about your country? Now, the position has worsened from February, where Prof Matthew said our borrowings for this year, 2017-18, would be about 3.9% of GDP. But there was hope that it would get better to below 3% of GDP by 2020. Well, that hasn't happened, and the revised figures released in October show that actually our borrowing for this year will be 4.3% of GDP at best, and it will increase it will decrease to only 3.9% by 2017. These are the figures of the new Finance Minister Gigaba, and they are not impressing the world. Everybody's saying, oh, very gloomy stuff for South Africa. Added to this, South Africa has benefited from a low oil price for the last few years. That trend is going back to $60 or $70 a barrel. We've also last year benefited from lower maize prices. But now with the exchange rate weakening in the last 6 months, we're in a very dicey position with regard to fuel, and particularly. Then, of course, the new sensation, the book, The President's Keepers, all about the state National Treasury takeover and other sensational stories about what is going on in South Africa. It's going to take years to get to the bottom of this. We saw that Mugabe was in power for 37 years. Now, suddenly he's out of power. Whatever happens in this, it's going to take years to unravel. Is it true? Not proven yet. And as all we can say at the moment is, well, if it's true, may their graves be on a mountainside where the sun will never shine. So that's going to take a long time to sort out. But in the meantime, South Africa is actually growing. Here's the makeup of the South African flag, if you want it. We have 1 million disabled people. Add to that 3 million AIDS orphans. Add to that 10 million child grant recipients. And you've got 25% of the population. Then there are about 1 million students who want a free education system in South Africa. Then there are 3 million social pensioners over the age of 65 with absolutely nothing but their pension. Now add in 7 million children not on child grants because their parents have a job, and then add in a staggering 18 million people who are unemployed or economically inactive. That's the one you've got to watch. Why do we have this huge unemployment in South Africa? What is the real cause of that? So, I'm 80% full on the flag before I found a taxpayer. Then come 7 million taxpayers who are below our tax threshold of 75,000 Rand a year. So they only pay your transaction taxes. And finally we get to the taxpayers. There are first of all 5 million or so taxpayers in the lower rungs of the tax orders. That is effectively up to the top decile for taxpayers. And then we are left with this tiny group of South Africans, about less than 1 million of them, the super taxpayers, the top 1% of South Africa. And they will say, we hold South Africa together because we pay 62% of the personal tax in South Africa. And we are the mortar in the wall. And that's all very fine indeed. But when one looks at that flag of 56 million people, 1 million wealthy are not going to hold it together. And that is something that the wealthy South African has to keep in mind all the time. Who else lives in his country? There are a lot of people here. So, all is not that rosy under the South African flag at the moment. We have population growing at an enormous rate. We have unemployment. We have sluggish economic growth. Piketty came out to South Africa 2 years ago. And he said, sorry, I don't have much to offer you. All my work on inequality is based on France, United States, all places with a relatively stable population. So economic growth is then true economic growth. But South Africa is different. Our National Development Plan said that the South African population would not grow beyond 60 million people by 2030. But those measurements were taken in the height of the AIDS pandemic in South Africa. Now that we are delivering antiretrovirals, the population is growing. And average life expectancy is growing. So by the time we get to 2030 and the maturity of the National Development Plan, there'll be 65 million South Africans, and we don't have a plan for them. This brings up the most important point, the lost generations of South Africa. Now, we've all seen that picture. Hector Peterson, 16 June 1976. And it's always looked as being Hector Peterson. But there's another part to that picture. What happened to South Africa's youth from 1976 and even before that? So if you take South Africa's generations in the post-war era, you say, what are they like? Well, first we have Generation Jones, the oldies, left behind by apartheid, most of them. Then we have the baby boomers, my age, most of South Africa left behind by apartheid. When one gets to Generation X, they were not only left behind by apartheid, but they were caught up in the struggle that went on then for nearly another 20 years, where education got behind. So the generation gets left behind. The next generation, your Generation Ys of South Africa and beyond, they then get caught up in transformation. We've got to the new South Africa, Mandela's delivered us, but we have to change the system to ensure equity for all, and that does not happen overnight. And in transformation today, we've got all sorts of chaos and difficulties in South Africa that are leaving people behind again. What we've got to do, and the important point from this lecture is, where's the future? Are we going to say, take South Africa's millennials and the next generation, let's call them Generation Bieber, and say, are they going to become the next lost generation in South Africa? If that happens, then yes, we can take the really dark view of South Africa into the future. And this is where education becomes the key driver. Now, Gordon will talk about let's look after the rating agencies. And that will obviously feature when one talks about the final downgrades to junk status. But the important point is that South Africa is not overborrowed internationally. Most of our debt is local debt, and our financial institutions have impeccable corporate governance. Best in the world. All of this is inherited now by Muzi Gagaba, and he's got to work with it. The resources are the same no matter who is the Minister of Finance. So we come back to Piketty again. And what has he said about education? Well, Piketty looks largely at higher education. From his book, you can see his conclusions here, where he says the poorest income deciles have the lowest chance of attending university or college, as they call it in America. So if you're in the poorest deciles in America, you have about a 25% chance of attending college. But when one comes to the richest deciles, decile 10, they've got a probability of nearly 100% of going to college. So economic policy, suggests Piketty, is to say, well, we must provide financial aid for the poorest deciles, a little bit in the middle, and the rich must pay their own way. Government mustn't be subsidizing that. And that argument has gained some traction, but there are other aspects to it. How much money is there? Well, Mandela started this trend in South Africa where we spend a fortune on basic education. It's the biggest item in our budget. It's bigger than all of the rest of them, and it's still growing, except for another tiny little budget that we've got to consider, which is post-school education, universities and technikons. And when we look at that, that has been all the attention in South Africa over the last couple of years, because our students have said fees must fall. So what do we get? We get a budget for universities and commerce that basically goes on the basis we have to have colleges and skills training development, and then we have an intervention, NSFAS, which subsidizes the poorest of the poor. Then there are government subsidies, and then we build other universities. Now, when we take those budgets, because the students have jumped up and down, something's been done about it. Those budgets are growing faster than the others. But we must go back and say, but what about everybody else? So the money is increasing for tertiary education. What's happening with basic education? We have even got a new financial aid scheme for our tertiary education, and we've looked at that and we think that's quite a good idea. The Davis Tax Committee, which has looked at the tax system in South Africa, said we cannot afford to give free tertiary education for all because it will be at the expense of others. It cannot be pro-poor. We've got to look after the poorest of the poor first, and giving away tertiary education to everybody in South Africa, that is a regressive or no-go idea. So what we've got to say is, where has teaching gone wrong in South Africa? So we've got to ask the question, where has teaching gone wrong in South Africa? We've thrown the money at it, but we haven't got the results. And we've got to say, well, it's not only about the money. It's also about looking after South Africa's teachers. We've got 300,000 of them in South Africa, and they are feeling the pain. They don't earn much, very little, and they are trying to establish a middle-class family in South Africa. Many of them are victims of payday loan sharks. They're overdebted, and they don't see a future. Imagine going to work with that. That is your true problem. All we need is to say, our teachers are feeling abandoned. We must pay more attention to them. We've had report after report about what's wrong with the education system, and we must do this and that, and we must have this outcomes based, and then no, outcomes not the right way to go. We've spoken all about teaching technique. What we haven't spoken about is the teachers themselves. South Africans' teachers could be motivated by just looking at the following things. Give them a fair deal to buy a house. It's one of the greatest aspirations of a teacher. Help me build a house, and help me educate my children. And then, what a teacher likes to see is respect for their position and acknowledgement for what they are doing. A great form of the remuneration of a teacher is just the acknowledgement and respect that they're doing a good job, and we're not getting that right. Now, my name's Matthew. I'm a tax expert, and my mother was quite proud of that, Matthew the tax collector, but I have another side of my life, which is I like the sea and the fishing in South Africa and the beauty of it all. And I have a monkey on my back, which is, what is it that makes things change? That's what I talk about when I travel around this country. So I want to demonstrate a couple of concepts now, just through what I've learned from fishing. So here are my fishing experiences. If you give a man a fish, he'll expect a bigger one tomorrow. So we don't do that often. But we come up with a clever suggestion. Oh, somebody hasn't got a boat, let's take them fishing with us, and there will be more fish to go around. But when you take them fishing, they're not happy, they get seasick, they break all the kit, they come home, you've got to gut a fish for them, and you still give them a free fish. Why? They don't know how to fish. Now we've got to take that basic concept and look at it in the context of education in South Africa. So the Chinese proverb says, give a poor man a fish and you'll feed him for a day, teach him to fish and you will feed him for a lifetime. It gets a little bit more complicated because I've learned you can't teach old people to fish. You teach people to fish when they are young. And the same goes with education. Let's try it. Tiger Woods could hardly walk and he picked up a golf club. Same went with Lewis Hamilton. Where did the love come from? Jobs talks about love what you do. These people have been loving what they were doing since they were 4 years old. That's where the passion comes from. Passions come from early on in life. And we translate this into what's called the production function. So the production function says, labor is L. To that you must add capital, K, machinery, money, infrastructure. And to that you must add technology. And if you bring all of those things together, the outcome is what we call gross domestic product. How well your country is doing. Now, when gross domestic product is performing, tax receipts are up, employment's up, those are the happy times. But let's be careful here. We're saying in labor doesn't do it on its own. We're going to say capital doesn't do it on its own if labor doesn't know how to use it. And technology is useless to anybody if you don't understand it. So the production function cannot work without education. So, when we look at the evolution of mankind, we've got to say there are other aspects other than the physical that gave rise to man. And they're not that apparent. Let's explain them. If you go north of Johannesburg, when you are out in South Africa, you can go to the cradle of humankind. That's where man started. And we ogle it and we say, gee, look at that, and but we don't really get the point about what man is about. To get the point about what man is about, look at a skull. And we say, what's in that skull? And people come up with all sorts of things like, it's got a bigger brain capacity and all sorts of things. The biggest thing to note from the human skull is quite simply, it doesn't have big teeth in it. We're the mammals that learned to smile instead of biting. That's a very important point. We had to work together. So, we are saying, you can't sit in a cave all your life. Somebody's got to go out and make the money for the food, put food on the table. People have to work. They like to work. But if we've got one eager beaver who goes after a mammoth or a mammoth problem, run away. He's going to get stuffed up. It's not going to work. So, back in the days of the caveman, the first application of the production function goes like this. Look, everybody, I've got no teeth. I'm not going to bite you. I smile to show you I've got no big teeth. Why? Because I want you to work with me as a team. And working together as a team, hey, we've got a prospect. But you've got to know what you're doing if you're going to work in this team. Otherwise, you're going to get in the way. You've got to be able to make a contribution. That is the first application of training and technology, going all the way back to the caveman hunting the mammoth. That's how we became Homo sapiens. So, now we bring the economists into the room. Now, a lot of people say, hey Matthew, this is where you lose me. Let me show you a simple application of economics. We're going to talk about labor supply. How much labor is out there to be hired? And there is a curve. It works like this. Take a chap called Al Bundy. Al Bundy sits in front of the television all day. He's not inspired. He doesn't want to work. He says, it's not worth my while to work. So what's he saying? I'm going to sit at the bottom of the production function. The real wage is not enough to interest me. I'm going to sit. So there's very little labor going out in supply. Now we'll take another guy. We recognize that face. And this guy's really bright. And he's so keen to work because, hey, I'm earning so much money, I want to be at the top end of the labor supply function. So that's how much labor is offered on the market. Come and hire me. Now it gets complicated because people wanting to work is one thing, but who is going to employ them? Obviously, businesses got to employ them, and businesses got to pay them. So now we introduce the labor demand curve. There it is. This is the falling curve. And we put Al Bundy up in the left-hand corner. Because to a business, he's producing so little that his real wage is a very expensive prospect. So businesses will hire as few of them as possible. But if we take Mr. Zuckerberg, everybody wants him. We can do the same thing with soccer players. An also-ran soccer player, we don't even know his name. A top name, my goodness, that's valuable. Everybody's looking for him. So that's the labor demand curve. So let's have some conclusions. Skilled workers are actually cheaper to hire per unit of production. So there's a greater demand for skilled workers. It's simply no use to just want a job. You've got to have something to offer. So now, let's really blow your mind with economic theory. And we're going to put two graphs on top of each other and explain what the problem is in South Africa. The red line is there. It says, there are a lot of South Africans who want jobs. 18 million people are either unemployed or economically inactive. But because they don't have the skills, business doesn't want to hire them. That creates the predicament that we're in today. But if through education you can move the labor demand curve out to the right, you make people more skilled. Therefore, people want to hire them. Then a miraculous thing happens. It has a double-edged effect on the production function. The production function moves upwards and outwards. So by training people, we get a higher production function and an increase in GDP, and that makes everybody happy, economically at least. Now, South Africa is investing the money into basic education. Why? To try and move up the production function. But it's not getting through. It's not happening. We haven't got to the bottom of this crisis yet. Now, I'm a fan of dogs, and I talk to them all the time. And sometimes we talk about the meaning of life and what does it mean in financial terms. This is the conclusion I came up to with Clash. We said, when it comes to your wealth spectrum in life, you either have nothing, or what in South Africa we affectionately call fokol, or you can be extremely wealthy. But wealth is not the only thing in life. You've also got to be happy. So, when it comes to happiness, you can have fokol, or you can be very happy. Those two lines are not interrelated. But we can get clever and invert them. And what can we say? What we really want in life, best practice, is to be happy and wealthy. Now, an accountant can't increase your life if you are unhappy. That's where you've got to go to a shrink. I can't just make you happy like make money for you. Only once you are happy, then I can improve your life by making you more financially successful. So happiness is as important as wealth is in this whole debate. So now we look at what was supposed to be and seemed to be the miracle that was going to change education, the tablet. We can put some fantastic stuff on tablets. In unit cost of education, it's much cheaper. It hasn't caught on in South Africa. People blame it on expensive bandwidth. But there's more to the story as to why e-learning is not working in South Africa. It is working in parts of the world, but there's essential ingredients missing in the context of South Africa. E-learning is not going to solve South Africa's problems. So, there's a guy most of you will recognize. Yeah, but when you ask some South Africans where did he go to school, maybe not. Well, of course, he went to Eton. And what is fascinating and has been introduced to me by one of the people who was at my lecture in Franschhoek is the work that Eton is doing on schoolboy happiness. You have to be happy if you are going to be successful. So now we're going to do happiness research. What makes you happy? And Eton does a remarkable thing. They go out and they do a survey on the levels of happiness at Eton. What makes people happy? And the studies reveal that there is a very positive correlation between a pupil's academic achievement and their level of happiness throughout their levels of school. So if you're happy, you can be successful. But now you've got to ask the question, what makes you happy? A good joke? Lots of money? Those are short-term rushes. We need to look for the real things that make people happy. And Daniel Gilbert is a researcher into happiness. And look at this, he says, I don't care about your gender, your religion, your health, or even your wealth. What I want to know is your social network, about your friends, and how you create bonds with them. Because your friends and your bonds with your friends, that's what leads to happiness. Fantastic. So, he continues and he says, deep connections with others and enriching the lives of others are the foundation of happiness. Feeling competent also increases your happiness. The fact that people feel confident in their abilities, that's adding to the pot. So what Eaton is saying is, we are wanting to get to happiness through social support, autonomy, being able to do things on your own, competence, and then the last one, gratitude, which we'll come to in a moment. So, this is what one of the Eton kids said. I think that this is a subtle way where boys are encouraging others to go and do more activities to distract themselves from their unhappiness. If you're unhappy, go out there and do some work. And when you have achieved something with the support of your fellow man, well, now you are on the right track. When people feel valued and that they are appreciated, that makes them happy. Regular meetings with people like tutors to talk about your life and to explore the future, that makes people happy. And the link between autonomy and happiness is also a consistent finding in this report. The more autonomous you are, the better. Now in Eton, they're talking about, hey, I went to school and I was away from mom and dad. Well, that's not the problem. Okay? What we are looking for is independence in your life. The more independent and autonomous you may be, the happier you will be. You can't remain a dependent all your life. And people say they have learned to work harder, and that has made their happiness increase. Hard work leads to happiness. Isn't this fantastic? And then the final graph, which completely blew me away, is measuring happiness against gratitude. Now, when you look at Eton, here are people amongst the most privileged people in the world. But what they are finding is that if people recognize their privilege and express their gratitude for their privilege, they get happier. Do you notice that money doesn't appear into this at any point? So, there I am with my grandchild. Now, I want him to be a big fisherman one day. But I can't simply put him on my boat and say, go to sea, boy, catch a ton of fish. It's not going to happen. I've got to start from younger, engage, help people, and in that way I will find happiness. They will acquire skills and autonomy, and they will acquire further happiness and become more motivated. Note, in all of this, money doesn't appear anywhere. Now, let's conclude with some statements. Thomas Piketty, in his book, Capital in the 21st Century, says, education and technology are the answer. Notice left out of that is labor and capital. They are also important. But he says education is the driver, and the education gets you to the technology. So that's Piketty. Let's try some others. Mandela. There's a great Mandela quote. Education is the most powerful weapon with which you can use to change the world. And you look at that and we say, Mandela was a philanthropist, or Mandela was a philosopher. No, Mandela was an economist. He realized that the hope for South Africa is to educate its youth, to move it up the production function, to increase our gross domestic product, to create a better life for all. Isn't that amazing? Mandela the economist. So in finishing off, I've been to this wonderful school in Franschhoek in the KUSASA project. I've seen smiling kids who are achieving things. They are learning. There are 200 kids at that school. We've probably got 20 million kids to educate in South Africa, so we need like 10,000 of these projects. What's the importance? Why don't we just give them all a grant? Well, go back to Michael Sachs's study. If we don't find 9 million good new jobs in South Africa in the next 50 years, there will be social chaos. The taxpayers of South Africa cannot support the generations that have been left behind. So, it was a wonderful visit. Go there, have a look at it. Take an interest in the education of young people in South Africa and education generally in South Africa. South Africa has 56 million people. They can either be a liability or it can be the most incredible resource in the world. We only need to get our education right. Hey, we can take our place right up there with the best. And I dearly hope that one day we will. Thank you for your attention. You can see more of my stuff on my website, profmatthewswall.co.za. There's my email address. You can also see more videos, etc. on this website, criticalthought.co.za.